I'm Mike Pence. I'm from Indiana, and it's an honor to welcome the largest gathering of conservatives in American history to your nation's capital. We stand together at a historic moment. How we as conservatives respond to these challenges could determine whether America retains her place in the world as a beacon of freedom, or whether we slip into the abyss that has swallowed much of Europe in an avalanche of socialism. While some are prepared to write the obituary on capitalism and the conservative movement, I believe we are on the verge of a great American awakening, and it will begin here and begin now. Let us stand and fight for freedom. I'm Mike Pence. I'm from Indiana, and it's an honor to welcome the largest gathering of conservatives in American history to your nation's capital. We stand together at a historic moment. How we as conservatives respond to these challenges could determine whether America retains her place in the world as a beacon of freedom, or whether we slip into the abyss that has swallowed much of Europe in an avalanche of socialism. While some are prepared to write the obituary on capitalism and the conservative movement, I believe we are on the verge of a great American awakening, and it will begin here and begin now. Let us stand and fight for freedom.
Good evening. I'm Jenny Beth Martin with Tea Party Patriots Action. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Earlier this afternoon, we did a press conference standing for the Second Amendment on Capitol Hill. And this evening, we wanted to bring to you some of the people who were at the press conference so that you can hear their personal stories about how they were impacted by gun violence and also why they stand for the Second Amendment and for all of the rights that are protected in the Constitution. Tonight, helping me host this online forum is Randy Corcoran. He is from Colorado. He is one of our activists and leaders in the state of Colorado, and I am really glad that he's helping. He has a radio program, and so he'll be helping me tonight. And then let me go around and introduce you to everyone who is going to be talking with us tonight, and then we'll get right into it. So to start out, we have the Republican leader in the Colorado legislature, Patrick Neville. Patrick was a survivor of Columbine, and he'll be able to talk to you more about that tonight. Then we have Alex Skarlatos, who was one of the 3 Americans who helped stop the terrorists on the train to Paris in 2015. You probably remember hearing about that, and Clint Eastwood did a movie, a documentary about that experience. And he will also be talking to you not just about that, but about 2 other incidents that he had to deal with personally, and why he stands for the Second Amendment and the entire Constitution. Then we have J.T. Lewis. J.T.'s brother, Jesse, was killed in Sandy Hook. And he is a very strong proponent of the Second Amendment. And he's really just an amazing young man. You're going to get to learn more about J.T. and also about the kind of young man that his brother was. So you'll be able to hear about that tonight. And then we have Susanna Hupp. Did I get it right?
Yeah.
Okay. And she was impacted by gun violence in 1991 when someone ran a truck into a restaurant that she was at with her parents, and then came into the restaurant and started killing people with a gun. She will talk about that and her personal experience about that. Also, she was at a hearing today. She was not with us at our press conference because she was doing something more important. She was testifying before Congress today in the Joint Economic Committee, talking about gun violence and the Second Amendment. So she can talk a lot about that. finally, we're joined by my sheriff from my county, Frank Reynolds. The reason that we have the sheriff from my county is that about 2 years ago, there were 2 students at the high school that my children attend who were planning a Columbine-like event. It wound up making Drudge, not exactly the kind of news you want your high school to make Drudge for, but it was on Drudge. Because some citizens reported what they overheard in a restaurant, the local police and sheriff department and the school police were able to act. They arrested the 2 students who were planning this Columbine-like event. They had a hit list and bomb-making devices and weapons, and they wound up being convicted to 40 years each. 20 years in prison and 20 years parole. I'm a mom. I'm a mom and a parent like many of you who are watching tonight. I understand the concerns that we have about what happens when we send our children to school and if they're going to be safe or not. And also, like many of you who are watching tonight, I respect our constitutional rights and I don't want to do anything that will infringe on those. So we're going to have a discussion tonight, and I hope you enjoy this and that you'll share it with your Facebook friends and with your own network to let other people hear these stories and how all of these people here stand for our Second Amendment rights. Okay, Patrick, I think we should start with you. So tell a little bit about your life experience and what led you to be here tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm here tonight mainly because we need to stop Congress from taking on a radical experiment that will not only violate our Second Amendment rights, but also due process rights. I was there. I was a sophomore, 15-year-old kid when Columbine High School, when that happened, when those 2 lunatics came in and murdered my friends and one hero teacher as well. And that day had a huge impact on me. And a lot of things that people don't realize about Columbine as well is there were 2 propane tanks in there that were linked to a bomb that luckily they didn't go off. Had they gone off, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you today. So I do get a little upset when people just focus in on the guns because there's other ways that these lunatics can hurt people. When I look at red flags specifically, that's, I think, probably one of the more dangerous laws that are out there, when you can take away someone's fundamental right without them even knowing a hearing happens and them not actually being able to defend themselves. I think not only is that going to put law enforcement in danger, it's going to put law-abiding citizens in danger. Take a look back at Columbine High School. People were talking about doing assault weapons bans now. Well, we were in the middle of an assault weapon ban when Columbine happened. It didn't stop it. Now there's discussions about doing universal background checks. Columbine, that wouldn't have stopped Columbine either because those students actually obtained the weapons through straw purchases, illegal purchases. And Colorado actually has a universal background check, and what we've actually seen since they passed that is actually crime has gone up in Colorado. So I don't think that's going to solve the problem. And so I think we need to prevent Congress from taking some radical step that's not actually going to solve any of these problems. I think the biggest thing we can do is actually end the gun-free zone policies because we see most of these mass shootings happen in gun-free zones. And we need to give good people the ability to actually protect themselves.
Okay, and Alec, what about you? Tell a little bit about what happened to you.
I was on the 1517 train to Paris when we noticed that there was a gunman on the train. Me and my 2 friends helped subdue the gunman, and I mean, after that we wrote a book and a movie, and to me it just doesn't make sense to advocate for gun control because we were in the middle of a gun-free continent, Europe, and this guy got a fully automatic AK-47 and a handgun. So to Patrick's point about it not being all about guns, I mean, that's true because Europe has banned guns pretty much completely, and now they're just going more towards bombs and running people over with trucks. So logically, to me, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, if someone wants to kill somebody, they're going to find a way to kill them. I'd much rather get in a gunfight than a bomb fight because I don't carry a bomb with me every day.
Okay, and then JT.
I lost my brother Jesse in the Sandy Oak shooting almost 7 years ago, and in the months and years following the shooting, we looked to our elected leaders, so-called, for answers to solve the violence, and it wasn't something they could deliver on. And so, actually, recently I've taken it upon myself to find solutions. After every shooting, you see the push for gun control. And it's been happening since the Columbine shooting, really, in the past 20 years after every shooting. And after the Parkland shooting, I think I had enough. And I saw those kids get up, and I wanted to get up too. Not because I agreed with them, but because I felt sorry for them. They were going down the same dead-end road that we had in Sandy Hook. And so I started looking for attainable solutions, and for me that was securing the school. Now I'm not talking about arming teachers. This is a debate that's raged on in America, and you can't do it because the teachers don't support it. But what you can do is you can put a guard in there to confront the shooter when they enter. My brother was killed in his classroom. What happened was the shooter entered the classroom, fired a few bullets, and the gun jammed. In that interval, Jesse yelled for his classmates to run, and 9 did. And he saved 9 lives. He was only 6 years old. But he shouldn't have had to do that. There should have been someone there to protect him. It shouldn't have been up to a 6-year-old to do that. So, that's what I'm advocating for, and I'm actually running for state senate in Connecticut because I believe Connecticut should show the country, should use that platform it has after having such a catastrophic mass shooting. Use that platform to show the rest of the country how it's done. And that's something I think we can still do 7 years later, and that's why I'm running.
Thank you for that. And your brother's story, just every time I hear it, it breaks my heart a little bit.
Thank
But
you.
he really was a hero, even at
He
6
was.
years old.
Who else?
Dr. Hupp.
And I don't want to follow that story. Just so back in 1991, I was with my parents at a local cafeteria, and back at that time in the state of Texas, we didn't have concealed carry. I had dutifully left my gun out in the car where it was completely useless to me. And as you mentioned, a madman drove his truck through the floor-to-ceiling window and very methodically began executing people. And yes, he had gotten those weapons legally. No, he didn't have any history that would have prevented him from having those weapons. The short version, I suppose, is that my father and I had put the table up in front of us. We got down on the floor, put the table up in front of us. My mother got down behind us. And when my dad saw what he thought was a chance to stop it, that's that World War II generation. He got up and ran at the guy and covered maybe half the distance. But the guy had complete control of the circumstances because nobody was shooting back. And so he just turned and shot my dad in the chest, and he went down about half the distance, about maybe 7 or 8 feet from me. And the good news was with that is that it made the gunman change directions slightly, and he went off to my left instead of continuing directly toward me and my mom. And after it had gone around the side just a little bit farther, somebody way at the back of the restaurant broke out a window, and people actually began to get out that way. We were kind of trapped up where we were. So when I saw what I thought was a chance, I grabbed my mother by the shirt collar and said, come on, we got to run, we got to get out of here. And my feet grew wings, and I was able to get out the back. Once I was out, I realized my mom hadn't followed me. And I found out from the police officers who were a building away, and several of them were patients of mine. I found out that what had happened was, in an odd twist of gun control fate, they had been asked by the hotel management to leave all of their weapons in their vehicle's trunks because she didn't want to offend any other patrons. And they said they spent precious minutes retrieving those weapons before they were able to run over to the restaurant. When they got in there, they didn't know who the gunman was. But they did see a woman out on the floor in the aisle, cradling a mortally wounded man. They said they saw another young man walk up to her, put a gun to her head. They said she looked up at him, put her head down, and he pulled the trigger. And that was my mom. They had just had their 47th wedding anniversary, and Mom wasn't going anywhere without Dad. And I've been angry ever since because I honestly felt as if the legislature had legislated me out of the right to protect myself and my family. And it's not a guarantee, but all those cops had to do when they got there was shoot a gun into the ceiling, and the guy runs because they're all chickens, right? So that's why I'm here today, to advocate for the Second Amendment.
Thank you for doing that. And Sheriff Reynolds, we were able to I didn't have anything to do with it. You and the others in the county were able to stop something from happening to my children's school without taking away rights. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you experienced as a sheriff?
Sure. First, let me say, wow, what a awesome group of survivors. Phenomenal. And Patrick, I was on the SWAT team. We were having training that day, SWAT training, when Columbine happened, and of course it was all over the news, and our team gathered around the TV that we could find. And, you know, from that point, tactics in law enforcement changed. There was a process that, you know, we would hold the situation and let SWAT get there, and that was a national tactic. Those days are over. Waiting for SWAT is not an option. And so what we do is we teach our law enforcement today is that first arriving officer is the person that's going to go in and do that. And I sent a letter out after Parkland, and no disrespect to anybody else, but just reminding our deputies of their oath that they swore to do in their obligation. And if they couldn't do that, that they needed to turn in their badge. But in this particular case, it was a collaboration of different agencies. And in this particular case, a family member saw something and reported it to her family. And those particular individuals in the family dismissed it. And she went to her dad, and her dad acted on it. And they contacted an agency, a municipality within the county, but it was outside their jurisdiction. They in turn called the school system, who has their own police force. Our county, we have, I think, 46 or 47 schools, 6 high schools. And so they have a limited number of officers. And to your point, I do believe that every school needs to have an armed security officer, a certified peace officer. And so collaboratively, we seized the moment. We didn't hesitate. We didn't wait. We didn't, just pass it off. But we all worked together. And by doing so, we were able to meet those individuals that night. And one of them, we didn't know there was a second one. And we took that person into custody and did an interview. And during the preliminary portions of that investigation, we realized there was a second person, and we met with them. And because of that, the actions of our officers in our county and the successful prosecution of these people, they were brought to justice. And one of the comments by one of the suspects in that, or the person who was found guilty, was just after the Las Vegas shooting. And her comment was, well, I think we need to get our numbers up. And to me, that's just troubling. But I think there's a systemic issue. And in my line of work, I deal with a lot of people that deal with mental illness. And so what I would like to see is not the chipping away at our Constitution, but putting these resources in our mental health facilities. You know, having some control or something over our social media and and the impact that has on our youth and the self-esteem problems that a lot of these children have because of our society. The manner in which the weapon delivery system is put forth, I don't think it's just a gun. I mean, they could do it with a car, they could do it with a bomb, they could do it with any medium.
A knife.
A knife.
Alec,
Yeah.
one of the men who was with you, you talked about how something happened to him in Sacramento.
Yeah, so about 7 or 8 weeks after our terrorist attack in Paris, Spencer, the tall blonde one from the terrorist attack, went out to the bars in downtown Sacramento with a group of friends. My younger brother offered to loan him his Glock to use because he knew that was not the best area. Spencer said, no, that's illegal in the state of California. I'm okay without it. He went down to the bars. Long story short, there was a gang of men. One of them punched one of the girls that he was with. So Spencer then started fighting them. They were losing a 5-on-1 fight, so they started pulling knives and stabbing Spencer. It basically was declared a homicide right away. They had a detective questioning him in the ambulance because they didn't think he would make it to the hospital. And long story short, he made a full recovery, which is amazing. But that night could have gone totally different just from any number of things. But if he had his if he took the gun that day, he wouldn't have had to risk his life to defend his own life and the lives of his friends. And I mean, same story on the train.
And then he probably would have gone to jail for having the gun illegally.
Well, quite possibly, yeah. But I mean, I'd much rather
Surely.
I'd much rather illegally carry a gun and go to jail than be dead.
Well, that's my point. I mean, you
Yeah.
talked about the lack of guns in the entire continent during your train incident. You look at London and other major cities over there where now that the guns are gone and knife attacks are on the rise, that they're talking about banning the knives.
And acid attacks and truck attacks and
You saw just last week in China that some guy went nuts and went into, I believe, an elementary school and stabbed to death 8 children.
well, hell, even in Japan, there was that guy that set that building on fire
Yeah.
intentionally with people inside, and I think he killed about 24 or 25 people, something along those lines.
I've
I
got
guess
two
they're
short
focused on the tools.
Exactly.
stories I'd like to share real quickly.
Okay.
My first cousin, my oldest cousin, until he was murdered, was one of the 3 victims at the Kansas City Jewish Community Center 5 years ago, where my cousin and his grandson were murdered and a woman was murdered by a white supremacist. My cousin was someone who was always prepared to take care of himself, well-trained. He was a doctor. He had firearms. He knew how to use them. But this guy was violating, he was a convicted felon, could not get legal access to guns under any circumstances, came up and shot my cousin and his grandson from the rear. There's not a law that they could create over in Congress that would have stopped that from happening. Someone who is evil and intent on doing evil is going to find a way. If they somehow took all of the 300 million guns in the United States, you could kill someone with your car, your truck, or just a host of other ways. The other story for me is a personal one. This was 20 or 30 years ago, closer to 30 years ago now. I was a mechanic long before I became a lawyer, and I got into a business transaction with a guy at my auto repair shop, and he decided he wanted to rescind the transaction, and I told him no. And so he backed his car out of the shop, had his wife in it, and he came walking back in, and I had that feeling in the back of my neck, just like something foreboding is really happening. And I wasn't involved in politics or guns or shooting or anything else really, but there was a gun in the shop that belonged to a painter that worked for me. And I went and grabbed it. And I came out and I said, Al, you need to leave. And he kept coming. He's a big guy, evil in his eyes. I finally pulled the gun around and I shot a bullet into the dirt. I said, you gotta go. He kept coming, and I shot a second bullet into the dirt, and I said, I'm not gonna waste any more bullets. So he left, called the police. I got a ticket for discharging a firearm in the city and county of Denver. But several years later, I was driving down the road, and all of a sudden his name popped up on the news because he had murdered his wife and an Albertson store manager and a Douglas County sheriff in Colorado. And so I was left with this quandary. Had I shot him that day, 3 people might have been alive. He was unarmed, so I probably would have gone to prison for that. On the other hand, had that gun not been available to me, what might have happened to me that day? Would I have been his first victim? Were there other victims that he had? So it was just something to be sitting over there and watching the hearing that you testified in and that we all attended, and see particularly one side of the aisle talking about all these different new little pieces of law that they're going to put into place that just simply don't take into account all of the day-to-day situations that individual citizens with a God-given right to keep and bear arms could literally handle on their own and probably prevent and reduce a whole lot of gun violence.
Can I just say that I think it's important to note that most of those people on the other side are not completely stupid. Having said that, that leads me to believe there's an ulterior motive. And so when they are nitpicking all these little things that we know are not going to make any difference at all, what is it leading to in your brain? I think it leads to what they ultimately want, and I think Representative Beto O'Rourke said it perfectly. He said exactly what they are all thinking. I want your gun. If your gun can kill somebody, I'm going to take it. He just wasn't as eloquent in how he did it.
And these are always people that are surrounded by walls and surrounded by armed guards
Yep.
and are driven to their places in cars with protection virtually around the clock. And
Plus-
I think you're right, it's a political move, not some kind of a moral standard that they're holding.
Well, that's the disgusting thing about it is, I mean, if you pass gun control, obviously the only people that are going to abide by those laws are law-abiding citizens who aren't going to kill people in the first place.
Yep.
So you're only disarming law-abiding citizens. I see no way that affects criminals or their intention to kill at all.
I agree. That's why I'm a big proponent of ending gun-free zones, because I think we're inviting these people in. When you put a sign up on a school that says no guns allowed, I mean, when I met with the president, he said it pretty well. He said that's like going in for the ice cream for a lot of these killers. And so we need to deter these. And these, I mean, these are really domestic terrorism. That's what we're talking about. It's not just school shootings. We should call it domestic terrorism. And if you look at it, Timothy McVeigh never fired a single shot. Look how many hundreds he's killed.
Fertilizer, let's ban that. And trucks to carry it in.
Well, if I can add to that, is one of my concerns about the encroachment on the Second Amendment rights is this whole idea of what you just talked about, we're going to take your guns. That implies me. You know, we are, as a sheriff, I'm the chief law enforcement officer of the county. In the state of Georgia, the sheriff is a constitutional officer. And so when you start throwing around that rhetoric, that's implying that I'm going to come to your door and I'm going to take your gun. Well, that's a violation of the Second Amendment. You know, if you look at the Second Amendment, it's got like 27 words in it. Shall not be infringed is probably the most important. So what you're going to do is you're going to put our law enforcement professionals at risk, trying to obey a law which is not a constitutional right. And then the other thing that you're going to do is you're going to turn law-abiding citizens into criminals. So whether it be a gun buyback program or something else, now you're turning that person into a criminal. I've got real issue with that. And so on my watch, that's not going to happen.
I mean, couldn't imagine being that police officer in Maryland that
Right.
probably was doing his job, but now he's probably living with the guilt daily that he shot what was an innocent man. So I think what the sheriff is saying is absolutely right. And, you know, in Iraq, I had to give orders to stack on doors and do different things like that, and it's not something you do lightly. So that's why I say I think those red flag laws really put our police in danger too, and it puts you in a horrible position to have to give that order, even if you don't give it. I mean, either way, you're in a lose-lose situation.
Well, and what happened in Colorado goes to your point, Doctor, about a political motive rather than a moral or practical motive for some on the other side, because Patrick, as minority leader of the Republican House, and others in our state of Colorado fought aggressively against what will become, in January 1st, the most onerous and least protective of due process red flag laws in the state. And we watched the testimony and part of those conversations. During all of those conversations, there was no interest on the other side in addressing mental health and using the mental health courts and the mental health laws to actually bring somebody who may be a danger to themselves or others under state control till they can be assessed or treated. It was going after the guns, period.
Yeah.
Yep. In fact, we tried to amend it
Yes.
and into actually maybe lowering the threshold of a 72-hour mental health hold to give law enforcement some actual tools to get the people some help. And they shot down that amendment because it was the whole motive was going after the guns.
And there's a, sorry.
No, I was going to say, you mentioned something about this today in your testimony.
Yeah,
The
and-
mental health versus threat assessment.
And I want to be real careful because, as I said before, I'm not a mental health professional, okay? But my understanding, my husband is a criminal psychologist. He's worked closely on a couple of these mass shootings, and he's made it crystal clear that in most cases, your guy was an exception. In most cases, these people would pass a mental health assessment. They are not mentally ill in the classic sense of how psychologists use the term or the diagnosis. but they would not pass a threat assessment, which is a different thing. There's mental health assessments, risk assessments, and threat assessments. And a threat assessment, if I understand correctly, we currently in law have the ability to go in and snarf these people up, as I said in the hearing, and assess them to a higher level. And then depending upon whether or not they pass that, we can assess them to a higher level and we can hold them during this time. Now, whether that's constitutional or not, all I can tell you is it's currently in law. The problem is we just don't have a, there's nothing, what's the word I'm looking for? There's nothing that it has laid out the steps for law enforcement to take across the board, anything that's consistent. So I think that's where we could really step in and maybe make a difference. He says, I should put his name out there, but he says that a lot of these guys could be nabbed, almost all of them, like the folks that you caught. Those folks have put out warning signals, and they would not have passed and didn't pass, essentially, your threat assessment.
They made credible threats because they had a hit list and a kill list.
Do they have the means? Do they have the plan?
And
Those
they
things.
had both bomb-making materials and weapons
Yeah.
because they were trying to emulate what happened at your school.
In Parkland, the shooter actually made videos that he left behind saying he just wanted to be famous and he was going to kill kids doing it. And in Sandy Hook, my home, the shooter actually, in the first grade classroom that my brother was in 20 years later, he actually wrote a book called The Book of Granny. And it was about a witch that goes into the classroom and her broomstick opens up into a rifle and she kills kids. But no one did anything with it because there's no procedures, like you're saying, for them to talk to this kid and figure out what's going on in his head that he wants to kill kids.
I'd like to plug one more set of people who were not able to be here tonight. You mentioned Parkland. In Parkland, the man who committed the crimes in Parkland should have had a criminal record, but the way that the Broward County, they weren't enforcing the law, and they were allowing him to not be prosecuted and not get a record.
Well, it was
And-
worse. It was worse than that, Jenny Beth, because the Department of Education under the Obama administration had put forth standards where they were supposed to, rather than criminalize conduct of these students, they were to find every possible way to allow them to stay in school, not impact their record, and all of that. More politics involved.
That is correct. And I just want to, I'm going to plug this because I think it's so important. Andrew Pollock, who is the father of Meadow was killed in Parkland. He has a new book out called Why Meadow Died. And it details everything that went wrong in Parkland. And I've been reading it. I think that every member of my school board needs to read it. I think my sheriff needs to read it. I think every principal needs to read it. I think every parent needs to read it so that we can understand what happened there and make sure that we are learning from that. And I think every parent needs to be paying attention to it, or grandparents, so that you go back and make sure that the place where your kids are going to school, that there aren't the loopholes that happened there. And I haven't finished the book, so I don't know. I don't know all of the solutions, but I know there are things that I can begin asking questions about.
As long as we're talking about school shootings, we had another one in Colorado recently. It was at the Highlands Ranch STEM school. And one of the themes I heard when everyone was giving their introductions was just this heroism in place. We have an Iraqi war veteran here who's now back in public service trying to protect people's rights. What you did in the train in Europe is incredible. What your brother did as a 6-year-old, for goodness sake. What you would have done had you been empowered to do so and not left your gun in your car by obeying the law. And of course, we know sheriffs every day put their lives on the line. At that high school, a shooter came in, 2 shooters really, but the one that was confronted, 3 students without really a second thought got up out of their chairs and they rushed that shooter. And one of those 3 died, Kendrick, what's his last name? Castillo. Kendrick Castillo. The other 2 survived. But we don't teach that anymore. We teach our kids to hide under tables and to go in the closet and stay behind locked doors. And it's just so important. It goes along with the evil that you'll never you'll never cure unless we get back to a more moral society that appreciates our history and what it means to be good.
And the
And
other
just
shooter,
the last thing I wanted to, oh, go ahead.
the other shooter in that situation was actually detained by an armed security guard in the school.
Yeah.
And here we have the Democrats speaking to motives, pushing back against further giving the schools those kind of tools and resources because they're saying, well, it increases that school to prison pipeline is what they're saying.
Yeah.
And so it's, again, the politics in it, it's really frustrating.
And JT, just real quick, you mentioned that teachers don't want to be armed,
Yeah.
that's not a solution. And I would encourage you to be patient on making that conclusion. In Colorado, we have a woman named Laura Carno and a program called FASTER that teachers voluntarily sign up for if they're interested in being able to protect themselves and their students in schools. And she can't train them fast enough. So there may be a political push against that. You may get that from the unions and the people who...
I'm speaking from experience in Connecticut, a very liberal state.
Yeah.
No one's for that there.
Okay.
And whether or not you support it,
Sure.
it's not something that is feasible right now.
Nothing you
in
can
those
move.
kind of states. Yeah, exactly. And I will say, after the Sandy Hook shooting, my 8th grade teacher, and we didn't know about it at the time, actually carried to school every day, and I had him all year. We found out about it a couple years later. He got arrested, and he moved to Texas, and now he's a teacher there. You can imagine. But so teachers do want to be protected, and if you're not going to give them the opportunity to protect themselves with a gun, you need to give them an armed officer in school.
Right. And I don't think anyone would advocate for making a teacher do that. I think everyone's
Right.
advocating just if they would
No,
like
you're
to.
right. No, you're absolutely right. Actually, when I sat down with President Trump, he tried to explain it to me, tried to convince me. What he said was in remote districts and schools where the police are 10 to 15 minutes away, that's a situation where you want a teacher armed, and they can't afford an officer in the school. That's a situation where you'd have to look at that.
I've read I think in Ohio and in Oklahoma, a couple of school districts that have done that. And I didn't go back and reread the articles before tonight. So I'll try to find the specific links to share those. But in the places where they did that, it's almost model. I would say it's a model way to handle it because the teachers who are going to be armed have to go through every year and make sure that they actually can handle a weapon, and they wind up having to be at a higher level than even law enforcement does because they would be using them around children, and they want to make sure that they actually can handle the weapons. And it's in those places where it would take 15 minutes for law enforcement to arrive.
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, well, what I don't understand is, especially in places like Connecticut, where they don't want teachers to have guns, they just want to take guns from law-abiding citizens especially. It makes no sense to me because short of taking guns from law-abiding citizens, I don't understand why they can't implement other school security measures. There's a lot of other things you can do aside from arming teachers, like putting an officer in a school, like training kids in preventative measures or what to do in a school shooting. I know they're starting to implement that a little bit, but that should have been policy 10 years ago. And there's a lot of things that we could be doing without giving teachers guns that just aren't being done.
Simple things like locking the doors from the inside. My brother's classroom door locked from the outside, and there was no way the teacher was going out there to lock it. In fact, it was one of the teachers at that school didn't even have a key for the door, who was a sub in the neighboring classroom. So you're absolutely right that there are other things, a lot more bipartisan, though I think there's enough support to put officers in schools.
What I'd like to add to a point is, I mean, this is not anything new. I had to refresh my memory, but in 1927, you had the Bath school disaster where a person blew up that school and killed, I think, 44 people. So ask yourself, how many school fires have killed children in the last 50, 60 years? I don't know of any. And the reason is, through our architectural design, you know, our paint even, you have flame-resistant paint, you have fire drills, you have all these different mechanisms to ensure school safety. So why aren't we funding these type things to look at if there is an incident, what are we doing to fortify our positions and becoming a hard target? I know in our school system, you've got to go through 2 layers of security. So if you're visiting the school, you have to push a button. Does that foolproof? No, but it is a time delay. Are we teaching teachers and children to fight back, or are they going to be sheep? You know, are we conducting active shooter drills with our public safety to include fire and EMS, teachers, role players, even students? We do that during the summer. We just wrapped up an exercise where we pushed as many people through this training, and we do that regularly. So those are the things that I think we need to be doing, and not just painting this with a broad brush. The other thing is, if you compare it to, say, automobile accidents, something that I have to deal with all the time, especially among our young drivers. If you watch any commercial on TV and you look at the marketing for the automobile industry and the recklessness associated with those commercials, and then compare that to the death rate on our roads, are they held accountable? And I'm not suggesting that automobile manufacturers are deliberately doing something. I'm just saying, where's the accountability? Where's the comparison? And so, you know, there are a lot of questions in my mind.
So we've talked about several solutions, and I think that this is a good discussion. We've talked about armed security guards, ending gun-free zones, training kids in preventative measures, locking the doors from the inside, active shooter training, which all of us as citizens can do, because we've talked a lot about schools, but we had a situation in Walmart, and what happened in Las Vegas, those were not school shootings. So I think all of us as citizens should be thinking about what do we do and how do we handle a situation if it happens to us. What other solutions can you think of?
So we ran a bill in Colorado that actually got bipartisan support after we kind of put the Democrats in a bad position during the budget debates. They didn't want to be forced to vote against it. We actually ran a different bill a bill that allowed funds to be used through a grant program where the districts could have to match, because I didn't want districts just coming in for more money. I wanted them to have some skin in the game. But it allowed for basically security improvements, things like tempered glass. I mean, little things like that could save a lot of lives. It also allowed for training of individuals that come in and protect the school. So it could be a resource officer or a private security guard. But maybe it's locks, cameras, things of that nature. And so it's trying to actually put some real resources towards that. Unfortunately, the next year, after the Democrats got complete control, we tried putting more money into that fund, and it was shot down because they said they didn't want to fund resource officers. Another thing that we ran too, I ran a bill last year to create child safety accounts. I take a look at my experience in Columbine, and we had a lot of kids that didn't feel safe going to school at Columbine after that. We were lucky enough that we had open enrollment, and there was a brand new high school that just opened up nearby, so a lot of kids transferred over to that school. But if that hadn't been opened, they had no ability to actually go somewhere they feel safe. And as I started digging into this, I saw this case where a poor girl who was 14 years old, I believe, 14 or 15, was raped and had to sit in class with her rapist for 2 years while the trial went on, and he was convicted. And so we ran this child safety account bill so they could actually go to a school they feel safe for. And then I think if we actually did that, met those standards, you would have schools that would try to actively work and improve their safety features to attract more students to their school and more parents to the schools. So there's, I think, multiple different solutions we can take. I mean, I think ending the gun-free zones is probably the one that I'm biggest on, but we've done several different things to at least try to. But again, it goes back to that motive. Everything that we try that would actually solve this, the Democrats don't want to hear. They just hold out for more gun control.
Ending the gun-free zones, yeah, that's probably the number one thing. What I mentioned about putting together a task force to put together a cohesive plan that law enforcement and school personnel can follow when we do come across these people that we know. Write books like you were talking about that are obvious or appear to be obvious threats to other people. One of the things that I've been touting for years, and they're starting to do, is media should quit using the names and the pictures of the shooters.
Thank God you said
And
that.
they're starting to do
Yeah.
it. And believe it or not, the research is starting to show that actually makes a difference, because like you, I think it was you that mentioned that some of these people just want, or maybe it was you, that the guy just wanted to be famous, you know? And
Well, the
we've talked
Columbine
about,
killers are household names.
And I
unfortunately,
understand that,
yeah.
and that's one of the things that just ticked me off, and a lot of other people in the world, and that's why I started saying, you guys got to quit using the names and quit. I don't want to see their pictures. Show me the victims' pictures.
That's what I love about the STEM
And-
school shooting is no one knows who those perpetrators are. No one can even say their name, but everyone in Colorado knows Kendrick Castillo.
Right.
And he's a household name because he's the hero, and
That's
that's the way it
awesome.
should be.
And there's another thing that those of you that are in the legislature or thinking about being in the legislature, hopefully will be in the legislature, that I think you should consider. It's always been a thing, and the NRA and some of the other organizations have actually kind of supported this. If there's a business entity, here's an example. If my son works for a company that says, you can't protect yourself here, now listen, I'm a believer in private property rights. If you tell me I can't carry a gun on your property, okay, but if it's a public entity where you're inviting the public into that area, then at that point you have become, I should quit pointing at you, but you have become not only responsible for my safety, but you've become, in my opinion, financially liable for my safety. And I'd like to see that clarified in law, because God forbid, if anything happens to any of my family members in a place where they have said, you can't protect yourself here, I'm going to come in and I'm going to sue the pants off of that entity. Because again, when they made it to where my people couldn't take care of themselves, then they took on that responsibility and that liability. I think it would take one good
Right.
lawsuit, and people would quit doing that stuff.
I think that's an excellent point, though, but especially when you're talking about not using a shooter's name. Like, you tell me all these people that are like, let's do something, let's pass this anti-gun legislation. You're telling me you can't get bipartisan support to just pass a bill that says the media can't use someone's name in a
Wait,
story?
You
Hate
know
to
what-
restrict the press.
But they
Well, you don't want to
even-
restrict their First Amendment right, but they'll restrict everybody else's Second
Yeah.
Amendment right.
But
Exactly.
they shouldn't. There are standards or AP standards for how you report about suicides, because the press understands that if you talk too much about a suicide, you can create
Clusters.
You can create clusters. It is contagious. It can become contagious. And so they have standards for how they talk about it, the way that they put headlines down. They could create standards in these situations too, instead of having wall-to-wall coverage all weekend long after a shooting, so that whoever did it, whether you know their name or not, they have now become infamous because they're the Walmart person or this person or that person. Take a step back and just say, are we doing this because we're just trying to get more eyeballs and clicks, or are we actually trying to do the public a service? And they wouldn't have to pass a law. They could just step up and do the right thing.
I think they're starting to, because I've been seeing that now more and more.
Well, it takes us to demand it, too. I know when the STEM shooting was going on, that was the first thing I told. The assistant minority leader, Kevin Van Winkle, was down there on site because it was in his district, and he was talking to the sheriff, and I relayed that on. I'm like, do not release the name, no notoriety. The Pollock family's been big on this. So you mentioned Andrew Pollock
And
earlier.
all the Parkland kids
Yes.
have been big on it.
Which is great. And another solution, too, that the Pollock family has done, I don't know if you've seen this, but the dog program that he's got going on, where they actually train dogs in schools to respond to the sound of gunfire, and then they actually sniff out the gunpowder, and then they're trained to attack the shooters. But they're trained specifically for this, so it's not just like a normal police dog. It's trained for specific solutions to this. And the idea is that you have someone who's armed that gives the shooter a distraction until they can actually go in and take care of it. But again, it's a thing that wouldn't require more gun control. He's actually got a private charity where he's doing this and just trying to get these dogs in schools. You think schools would be loving this, that they would jump all over this, but they don't even want this, even though it's a private charity.
One thing that happened in Parkland, there's a young high school student, Kenneth Preston, I think is his name. Kelly may be able to correct me. She's sending me text messages. Kenneth Preston, right?
Yep.
He went through and he's amazing. He went through the financial records of the school district to see how they were supposed to be spending money versus what they actually did. And one of the intriguing things that I found out about was that they had allocated money for a a fire alarm system that would have, instead of pushing everyone right out to the hall, it waited, it paused for 30 seconds, 60 seconds, long enough to determine if there really was a fire going on or not. So when the shooter pulled the fire alarm, it went off and everyone flooded into the halls to evacuate the building because they thought it was a fire, or at least a fire drill. And they were supposed to have the system in place where they would have been able to come back and stop it before it went off. I didn't even know that that existed. I reached out to the principal at my school and said, have you ever even heard about this? And we don't have that at my school, but it's something like that. You were talking about the paint on the walls, the fireproof paint, and that we make our buildings safe from fires as much as we can. These are a few other things that we could be thinking about as we're looking at how to protect at least schools or in places where people would flood into one particular area.
There's camera software out there now that's being put to use for corporations. You're seeing it in some schools, and it's similar to facial recognition, but it can tell if you're wearing a particular color jacket and a hat or a beard, and so they can identify people in crowds much more easily. The metropolitan areas and some schools use it. So things like that, as they become more affordable, allows us to respond to those incidences more effectively. Again, I think there are mechanisms out there that if we put an emphasis on it, and not just school shootings, respectfully, but any type of critical incident, whether it be a bombing or a shooting or a stabbing, whatever it may be, that we can do our job as first responders a whole lot better. The other point to just that is, I can't find anything in law that says I have a duty or a legal duty to protect people. I may have a moral obligation, but we can't be at all places at all times. Most of the time, we respond to an incident. Very rarely do we intercept it. In this case, it's responsible gun owners, and I love these stories when they happen in our community. We've had several instances where law-abiding citizens have stopped these criminals in their tracks with their legally possessed firearms, and those are the stories that need to be told.
There's actually like shot detection devices that they're starting to put into schools, so that if there ever is a shooting, they'll know exactly where it's coming from and know where to send law enforcement first. And I think things like that are great, but the point is, if you're not going to allow people to carry guns in a school, you need to have some sort of defensive or preventative devices in your school to stop these kinds of things. And I cannot think of hardly any schools that do that. And not only that, but also the bureaucracy of government. We need to be able to adapt to these things a lot quicker, because you're having shooters on their own develop better ways to kill people, and we're not adapting quickly enough on how to counter these different kinds of attacks, specifically things like Vegas, and God knows what's coming in the future.
One thing I notice is, and it's natural for me because I'm a mechanic, or I was, and so if they put it together wrong, I knew it wouldn't work. Conservatives, they hear things like shall not be infringed, and that's kind of like the end of the conversation. But there's a lot of folks out there that don't see black and white as clearly as we do. We saw it in the congressional hearing today. They were utilizing just the worst of stories, of the experiences that people went through, and then coming up with their laundry list of the ways they're going to repair it. The universal background checks, which is just a way to catalog gun owners for later confiscation and things like that. I think we could do a better job of learning to listen to people who aren't dialed into God-given constitutional protections, don't see things as black and white as we sometimes do. Make that connection on a personal level, and then instead of offering solutions all the time, start asking questions. Well, how would that solve the problem? Well, have you thought about if it's applied this way, or if it's applied that way, or who would enforce it? Who would make the decision? There are so many ways you can get people on the other side who, like we all do as human beings, have that immediate reaction. My God, we've got to do something. and they just want to put something into play and get them actually thinking about the solutions that are being proposed. We tend to like to ram things down our throat. We tend to like to ram ideas down people's throat. They tend to like to ram laws down our throat. For all the people out there who are just living their lives and vote, every couple of years, I think we really need to work on our communication skills and our listening skills first so we can make those connections.
JT, you said something I thought was very important at the press conference today, and it basically was, I'm rephrasing it, but we need to look in the mirror when we're looking for solutions. That is not the exact words that you used. Would you elaborate on what you meant by that and what you think? You've had a long time to think about this.
Yeah. No, because we've met with President Obama and President Trump, two men on the complete opposite ends of the political spectrum, and they really have done all they can at this point that we've asked them to do, and the shootings are still going on. And so what I've started to realize over the years is that maybe we're looking at the wrong person to enact change. Since Columbine, we've been looking to President Clinton, then Bush, then Obama, then Trump, and all the while not seeing much done. And so my thought was, we're looking at the wrong person. Clearly, we need to start looking at ourselves. This is going to be a grassroots movement, ending these shootings. It's going to start, community level, family level. And again, that's one of the cornerstones of my campaign, is basically trying to show other people that if you do want to do something, it's not going to happen standing outside of the White House with a sign. It's going to happen in your own community, and it's going to be you doing it there. And that's really important. Now, the other thing I want to say is that one of the major problems we're having right now is that the Democrats have taken an all-or-nothing stance with gun control. Now, they're not going to listen to any of the solutions we've mentioned tonight, and that's really why we're stalling. And it's unfortunate, but it is true. It is an all-or-nothing stance, and nothing's going to get done until we fix that mindset.
Connecticut needs to elect this man.
Well, that's a great point, though. I mean, we have in Colorado, there's a group of guys, they call themselves the Able Shepherds, and it's run by a former Navy SEAL named Jimmy Graham, who started this, and they actually go in and train these people to an incredibly high level. And I say this because he put me through 4 hours of training after my family was threatened, and I say this, I learned more in 4 hours with Jimmy Graham than I did in 6.5 years in the Army and how to protect my family. But these guys go through this rigorous training, pay for their own way to go through it, and what they do afterwards is they volunteer to come to different community events where there might be a threat. So we're having a big rally, to Stand With ICE rally on Saturday.
I'll be there.
And these guys are going to be there, these Able Shepherds, and they are incredibly qualified, trained individuals. So again, like you were saying, they're not coming to me trying to enact a law. It's good citizens doing the right thing, and I think JT's absolutely right. That's where the true solution is going to be.
You have to worry, though, or you have to at least be aware, and Doctor, you mentioned this earlier. Often some of the people that you, for instance, will be working with if you're elected to the legislature aren't really acting in good faith. They have an underlying agenda.
And I don't know if the gun control all or nothing thing is because it's a great issue to raise money on, or because they've become so entrenched in their corner. But go on.
Well, I'm just saying that unless you recognize that at least for some folks on the left, the agenda is much, much larger than the next gun control bill and the next step. There's a whole issue of globalism and central power, and the Democrats on the presidential level are now admitting that socialism is the new game. O'Rourke said that I will come and take at least some categories of your guns.
The ones that kill people.
Yeah. Right. And so it's just really important if you're going to be getting into a position of making laws, as some of these guys do, advocating, enforcing the laws. I do talk radio and work in courtrooms as a lawyer. That we're not always willing to take people at face value, because there's a lot going on that is far more dangerous than trying to get the next compromise bill passed.
Can I just interject something that you mentioned, and it made me think of, we were talking about solutions earlier, and I don't know how you would feel about this, but I think you mentioned that you work with veterans, or you have a lot of veterans in your area.
We do.
And I do a lot of work with veterans. That's my day job. And there's a lot of talk about people like you were just talking about. What did you call them? What was their names?
They call themselves the Able Shepherds.
Able shepherds that are veterans that are retired that want to be able to do something, and so and I believe they do this in Israel, where they allow these folks to come in. Of course, they have to get some specialized training, and they come in and they act as the school marshals, and there'll be a couple of them, and they're volunteers, so it's not a question of cost for the school. So, it gives them, it's actually very good because it actually gives them purpose. And we have an issue, with a lot of our veterans coming back and lacking that purpose. And it would give them purpose, and it would secure our schools, I think, maybe.
I spent some time in Israel last year, part of an exchange program, and one of the things that I did like about, many things I liked about the Israeli system it was a national movement to protect everybody. Everybody has a duty and a responsibility to protect each other for the survival of their nation. And we celebrate our differences, and to your point, sir, is maybe we need to start looking at our commonalities and our common goals, and whether it be left or right or center. I think we all fundamentally want the same thing. We want to live in a community that we're safe, that we can raise our family and have a good life. But I think you're right. There's political expediency. There's, my idea, and I want to cram it down your throat. But I think if we start celebrating what similarities we have and find common ground, that we're going to be better. And that was one of the things I learned in Israel. We visited a school, a police academy, and I didn't realize this, that how many Muslims there were in Israel. And so when we visited this academy, it was like visiting a police academy in the United States. These were all Muslim candidates, and it was, for whatever reason, it blew my mind. It never occurred to me, and I exchanged conversation back and forth, and this candidate or cadet, said, well, basically, I wanted to make an impact in my community, where I live, and the cops come around and they write us tickets, and it's kind of the same thing, you might hear here, and I want to be a part of the solution. And I noticed on his patch, there's this Muslim, and he's wearing the Star of David, and I asked him about it. I said, you're wearing the Star of David and you're Muslim. He's like, I'm an Israeli, and that really moved me. Here's this person. He is an Israeli. This may be his religion, but it's like us. We're an American, regardless of our, political sides or religious sides. We're Americans, and I think we need to come together and celebrate those similarities.
I think that's very important. I've heard things from some of our supporters and Tea Party patriots, and they're going, why are the Democrats doing this, and why are people pushing for these things? And I think it's important for us to remember that take a step back from the elected officials, because there's a difference in the elected officials versus everyday Americans. The everyday Americans, a lot of them are just afraid. They are afraid. They don't want to be in the situation that any of us were in. They want their family and their children and their friends and their neighborhoods to be safe. And they don't know what to do, and so they're looking for anybody to be able to solve the problem. And as you said, they're looking for their solutions. I don't think are right, but they're also looking in the wrong direction, because sometimes we have to stop and say, okay, it's not about what the president or the federal government or the state government can do, but what is it that I can do in my own community? And even in your own family, you talked about what you did with the Able Shepherds. After the Vegas shooting, and a week or two before this incident happened, or almost happened at my children's school, my kids and I had a very frank discussion about what do you do if there's an active shooter? What are we going to do? What are things that we need to start paying attention to and looking out for, so that we're not just shocked if it happens to us? And my daughter had some very real questions about what to do even at her school. And we went to the school on a Sunday and looked around at the school to think about and let her think through what she would do in a given situation. My point is, it even starts, like you were saying, it starts in our own homes, and then it expands from there. And I don't know that if I had not done that with my daughter and listened to the concerns she had, that a week and a half later, when I was getting alerts that for what was going on in my community, that I would have reacted quite the same way. But because I had just talked through that with my 14-year-old daughter at the time, it was, kids are thinking about this. Young children, middle school children, high school, elementary school kids, they're all thinking about it. And so I just think we have an obligation to look for solutions.
I think that what you're talking about a little bit with, trying to figure out how to solve this problem and how to reach out to the other side, I think the biggest problem is education, because a lot of these people are well-intentioned. Like you said, they want to do something to solve these mass shootings, but they can't tell you what an assault weapon is that they want to ban. The 94 assault weapons ban, they banned AK-47s, AR-15s, but Mini-14s, which function exactly the same, were totally legal. Makes no sense. They ban things because they look scary, and that's the other thing, is they want to ban these guns because they're commonly used in mass shootings, but yet they don't really care about solving the gang gun violence problem in Chicago and places like that, or even the suicide problem, which take more lives than mass shootings do. And I know that's kind of our pet subject because we all were involved in one or another for whatever reason, but the real issue here is just violence in the United States. It's not even really a gun issue.
It's not gun violence, it's violence.
Absolutely.
Well, and when you talk about suicide also, suicide is on the rise. And actually, one of the students in one of my daughter's classes committed suicide on the day that she had an exam in the class with him. And it rattled our whole entire, it rattled our community. But it made all of us as parents, you can tell we're looking out for everyone's kids a little bit closer and paying attention to signs and making sure that my point is, it's not just gun violence, it's paying attention to the people around you. And if they seem like they need help, reach out to help them. Or if they seem like they're about to do something wrong, report them.
We just need to build our sense of community back.
Right.
That's really what I think is one of the big contributing factors to the suicide rates and the society we live in nowadays. I'm sure it's more complex than that, but you get my point.
Yeah, we are our brother's keeper.
And I think, you were talking about readying your family. I think that's really important. There's a company in Texas, Broadus and Company, and he's ex-Special Forces, I believe. And he goes around and he's starting to reach out to schools and communities and teach them how to make themselves hard targets, as you put it. And, one of the things that I used to do with my boys, and they still give me a hard time about this, we'd be wherever and sit down, whether it was a restaurant or a theater or wherever, and I'd say, close your eyes. Okay, now tell me where the exits are. Where are the exits? You just being aware of, because one of the most important things in whether it's an active shooter or a fire, it's move.
Right.
You've got to move. And a lot of people have no clue where the exits are. So know where the exits are, number one.
Well, I'd like to piggyback off of that. One of the reasons that the three of us had the reaction that we did on the train that day was because, I'm young enough, we've grown up around these kinds of shootings in high school and things like that. And we used to talk about, more in a joking manner, like, what would you do if X happened? I'd jump on the shooter, or I'd do this or whatever. But even though we all had very different life experiences, none of us were in the military together, we had never trained together to do anything like this, we all were on the same page as to what we were going to do when we turned around and saw that gunman. So all it took was a spark of Spencer getting up first, or me saying let's go, or just turning around and seeing the guy and hearing the gunshot. We all knew what was about to happen. And so when we went for it, I mean, granted, we had a lot of things go our way, but you just need to kind of think of some of these things ahead of time, kind of like what you're saying. You need to be on the same page with your friends. If you're ever in a situation like that, what's the plan? Are you going to run? Are you going to try to stop the guy? I mean, the biggest thing after the terrorist attack for us was we had a train car full of people, but not enough people were doing anything to help solve the situation. Even if, I'm talking the aftermath, I mean, we needed first aid for the guy that was shot. We needed somebody to help us tie the terrorist up. I took the AK-47 and searched the rest of the train for another shooter or other wounded people. We had a lot of things that needed to happen in a very short amount of time. And even if you don't have any skill whatsoever with first aid, with firearms, with anything, if you just offer to help somebody that does, they could tell you to do some menial task, which would then free them up to do something important. And just people getting involved and offering to help or taking the time to learn first aid, I think would be a huge step in the right direction.
That's awesome. I appreciate you sharing that. And to your point, we had an opportunity to talk on the way over here. In my profession, we are paid to be brilliant in advance. And, the time to figure stuff out is not when it's occurring, but well in advance. What would you do? Just like the TV show, what would you do? Have that internal dialogue. Are you looking for exits? Are you looking for, threats? So to all those points, I think what we need to do is, just like what you said, is invest in our community. Some of the programs that we offer is, our Citizens Academy, our CRAZE training, Citizens Response to Active Shooter Events, and, and crisis management. And like I said, with my travel to Israel is have that understanding. What would you do in those certain situations? It could be a fire. It could be, an airplane crash. It could be a lone wolf. It could be a complex attack. And so what we need to do is have that conversation with our children, have that conversation with our spouses and our neighbors. One of the things we talk about is, at our town hall meetings is, back in the day, you had a front porch community. You sat on the front porch and you knew your neighbors. You knew what was going around. Now we sit on the back porch and we've got fences up. And we don't know who lives across the street or to the left or right of us. What we need to do is invest in our communities, know who our friends and our family is. And one of the biggest things that is a help in fighting crime in our area is being a nosy neighbor. A lot of the crimes that are solved in our community are because nosy neighbors call us and they say, something doesn't look right. Would you send a deputy over to take a look at? Half the time, more than half the time, it's nothing. But it's those small instances, such in the case where we had a nosy teenager looking at a notebook and said, something's not right here.
Right.
I need to say something.
And then it took a committed law enforcement and a committed school board and entire school system who were not afraid that there might be an arrest, that arrests might go up in the community. They'd rather make sure the community is safe rather than glossing over what might be.
Well, yeah, I think we learned in Parkland it's
I mean,
all about
that's-
follow-through.
Right, it's
Yeah.
in Parkland.
A template to follow through.
In Parkland, there was not the will or the leadership to do what needed to be done to prevent that. And in fact, the quote from Max Eden, who co-wrote the book with Andrew Pollack, what they say about Parkland is that it was the most avoidable mass murder in American history. And when you read this book, you realize that it really was preventable. And the work that you nodded when I talked about Kenneth, the work that Kenneth did, just looking at the books and seeing how they had not spent money that they were supposed to spend and mismanaged.
Millions of dollars.
Yes, and some of it was supposed to be on school security, and it didn't go where it was supposed to go. It's shocking.
Well, and I don't know who said it, but if it's predictable, it's preventable. So.
Okay, so we've been going for about a little bit over an hour now, so let me ask each of you one last question. What is the lasting thought or statement that you want to have to leave with people tonight and for them to consider as they go forward? It can be about anything that is on your mind about this topic.
Well, I'll go first. It's kind of our cliche thing that the three of us always talk about, but it's always, if something's going on, like I said, try to contribute in a positive manner. It doesn't have to be a shooting. You don't have to tackle the guy, but if it's a car accident, call 911. If you can learn any kind of first aid, how to do CPR, how to stop traumatic bleeding, carry the right equipment with you. I mean, these are all, it sounds like a lot now that I'm talking about it, but they're all very small little things that you can learn in 5 minutes. I mean, you can learn how to put on a tourniquet in about 2 minutes. You can learn CPR in probably 10 minutes. There's a lot of little steps you can do just to be a better member of society for your other human beings.
Very good. JT, do you want to go next?
Sure. So with my campaign, I'm hoping that lights a fire under our politicians in Connecticut and nationally to get up and actually do something about school violence and community violence. What's interesting is a week after I announced my run, the guy I'm running against, who by the way never took a phone call from my mom after my brother was killed in his district, he actually got $80,000 passed in school safety funding for his schools in his town a week after I announced, which showed me that a week into a campaign that is a year long, we're already affecting change in our district. And it's tough to run as a 19-year-old. They don't make it easy. But I think it's already waking up people across the country. We've had great feedback from across the country, people seeing the campaign and getting up themselves, like I said earlier, getting up themselves and recognizing that this is going to start at a community level. And so that's a lasting note that I'd like to leave with people.
How about you, Dr. Hunt?
We tell people every day, if you see something, say something. And unfortunately, not all of those cases have had the great outcome that your situation had. I think, again, that we need to create statewide task forces that come up with a cohesive, consistent plan for school personnel, law enforcement, and the community to follow, so that when we know that these people have a screw loose, we can catch them and hopefully prevent a future problem. Other than that, I'll say again that 350 million guns approximately last year didn't hurt anybody.
Can I just include, building off of that, you say see something, say something. That's so important, but someone's got to actually do something. And in so many of these cases, it hasn't been done. But in your case, you did do it. And so I think that's a great example for everyone else.
And I'll go next. To that point, I was watching the news this morning, and I think here locally, a school shooting was prevented. I don't know if any of you all saw that, but you might want to research that. Get to know your public safety. People don't call us when they're having a good time. They call us in a moment of crisis. But do you know the officer or the paramedic, the firefighter, the 911 operator that's going to handle your moment of crisis? Or are they just a part of something else? So get invested in your community. Know the people that are there putting their lives on the line each and every day, and do something for them. Show them their support. It's a tough time to get in law enforcement in our nation because of a false narrative. In my community, we're very supported, both financially and just a thank you from our citizens. But I would encourage you, next time you see a fireman or paramedic, an EMT or 911 operator, or anybody that's out there serving in that capacity, just say thank you. It means a lot. So I would say get involved.
Patrick.
I'd say don't be fooled. Don't let your politicians fool you into thinking that somehow expanding background checks or an assault weapons ban will solve this problem. It certainly won't. It didn't solve it. Like I said, in Columbine High School, would not have prevented Columbine from happening. My friends that would have not have allowed my friends to be here today. It just wouldn't have. Red flag, too, is an incredibly dangerous bill. They're trying to sell this as some sort of common sense approach, but it is anything but. It is, they actually allow someone to come in and no-knock your house. In Colorado, that's the case. They can actually do a no-knock raid without you ever even knowing a hearing happened. I think this is going to be a dangerous bill that's going to put law enforcement and private citizens in harm's way. So just don't be fooled. It's not just simply about limiting access to mentally ill. This is a very dangerous road to go down with red flag, and then the universal background checks, like Randy said earlier, are going to be that universal registry that we're going to have, and that's going to allow them to further confiscate guns, and that's what the aim is. So don't be fooled by your politicians. These won't solve the problems. It's just going to lead us down a dangerous road of taking away our freedoms.
Well, I want to just add one thing that Congressman Thomas Massie said at our press conference earlier today. There has not been a report from the Department of Justice since 2010 about background checks and what happens with them. The last report was in 2010. He's trying to find out why there hasn't and get more. But in 2010, there were 72,000 people who were denied the ability. Someone told me I have that wrong. 76,000. I wrote it down too, but 76,000 who were denied the ability to get a gun through a background check. There were only 30 of those who went through prosecution, and only 13 of those actually were convicted. And his question is, what happened to the rest of them? Either it's false, and you may know.
Yes,
they were talking
I
about
do know,
that.
and actually, yeah, John Lott
addressed.
addressed that before. Basically, they were. It was a mistaken identity. Apparently, the way they do the background check, they take your name and your social security number and approximate date of birth, and it's real wishy-washy. So particularly with minorities where there are similar names, like in the Hispanic community, they tag people who have a similar name or a similar birth date or something like that. And so they were basically false positives. And he was saying that you can go in and fix that pretty easily. I can't remember exactly what it was. I think it was using the first initial and the middle name and the last name or something like that. It's something that
Or it can
there
just
was an easy
be a mistake.
fix.
This actually happened to me. When I was in the Army, I went to go buy a shotgun. Here I had a top secret clearance from the U.S. military, and they typed in my social wrong. And so that came up. I got the call saying, you were denied a background check. I was thinking, wait a minute, I've got a top secret clearance here. I'm pretty sure something's wrong. And that tracked it down, and sure enough, they typed the last number wrong on my social. And so I think there's probably most of those, like you're saying, are the false positives.
They were like the vast majority of them were false positives.
And Congressman Massie really made a big point in the press conference today to say, then those people who have done nothing wrong at all are having their rights denied. And so that's something we need to be very mindful of, because background checks are being talked about a lot right now on Capitol Hill. One more thing about background checks. Andrew Pollack, I spoke to him on Monday, and he said it wouldn't have mattered in the case in Parkland because they didn't do anything. They said something. They knew that this person was a problem. He was even breaking the law, but they never arrested him. He wound up not having a record. So if you don't actually enforce the laws on the books, it's not going to show up in a background check. Okay, Randy.
Well, I'm going to plagiarize a little from the youngest person on this panel, JT, because I think his basic underlying premise is the most profound. We all have to look in the mirror. We have to all quit reacting to the latest tragedy or the latest story. On my radio show, I always look for those up to 1 million a year times where a good guy or gal with a gun saved someone's life or defended their own property or protected somebody else. We're always inundated with the negative ramifications of the extreme things that happen, and we forget to talk about the day-to-day heroes and the ways that preserving our Second Amendment right can keep us actually safer, not less safe, as we often hear from the left. So we have to take responsibility on ourselves to start with our kids and our friends and family, the people within our circle of influence, to get them looking about and thinking about these things in a different way. You can't go down a sharp ski mountain without standing up there and visualizing the path you're going to make through all of those bumps. And we need to get people to be thinking about when they walk into a place where they're exposed, or at the school or the movie theater, finding those exits. In other words, we need to encourage people to take responsibility for their own well-being, their own safety, and teach that in our communities and our families now.
Okay, Frank, did you speak? Did you tell the last?
I did, yes.
Okay, I wanted to make sure. Yes, you said thank law enforcement. Okay, so I was distracted momentarily, and I apologize, but we have one extra person who came in that I want to have a moment to speak. So if you don't mind, I'm going to swap you out, and we're going to be joined by two people. Actually, the first one is Congressman Chip Roy from Texas, who is at our press conference today. So we're going to just kind of slide. Yeah, sure. Okay. And then the other one who is going to come out in just a moment is John Lott, who also testified today with Dr. Hub. And so he's going to come out, and we're going to talk for just a couple of minutes more. So we're wrapping up, but I'm so glad that you're here, and I would prefer not to. And
Yeah, I can't believe it.
Here you were so nice to me, and now
no, we're.
Good to see you.
She actually said earlier that she hoped that you would be able to come, and actually all of us were at the hearing today and saw
Okay.
you, and we wanted you to be able to be here as well.
Well,
So,
thanks.
And I'm the one who texted you that you said, "Who's this?"
Okay, well, I mean, I appreciate you texting. You didn't tell me to
okay,
begin with.
so let me just take one moment to explain who we've got here. And we've got Congressman Chip Roy, who is from Texas. He worked on Capitol Hill before he became a congressman. He knows the ins and outs and all the games that members of Congress play, which winds up making him know how to be a much more effective congressman. He may not be loved among his peers, but he's loved among those of us who love the Constitution, because we know he sees through the games, he knows how to get his peers to fight, and he stands for the Constitution. And then we also have John Lott, and I don't know how to introduce you, except to say that you are like a walking encyclopedia when it comes to facts about the Second Amendment and gun violence. And I have listened to you speak, and I feel like I can't take enough notes when I'm listening to you. So with that, I'd like, you testified in Congress today,
Right.
and you spoke at our press conference. So
Right.
your state has been affected by gun violence.
Yep.
You've heard the stories of the people who are here. Why don't you tell a little bit about what you think about the Second Amendment, what's happening on Capitol Hill?
Well, thanks, and thanks for hosting this. Thanks for y'all to join it. It was great to see Susanna. It's great to see Dr. Lott, and appreciate all that you do for this issue. When I was a lawyer on the Senate Judiciary Committee, I worked with him, and here we are again now as a member of Congress. The issue obviously hits home in Texas, right? We've been touched by the violence that we've seen unfold, whether it was in Odessa, whether it was in El Paso. My wife grew up in Plano, which is where this fellow came from that went and did this horrible, this tragedy that unfolded in El Paso. It hurts, and I understand why people, want to have a response. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the data, when you look at what's happening, John knows this better than anybody, you see the truth, right? Which is that you've got bad actors who take a lawful product that we use as law-abiding citizens to defend ourselves against not just bad actors against us, but tyranny, and they use those products wrongly, right? No different than the evil individual that ran a car into the downtown mall in Charlottesville 2 years ago, right? And other examples that we can come up with. And so as a former federal prosecutor, special assistant U.S. attorney, I prosecuted felons in possession of weapons. I've prosecuted people who were not supposed to possess guns under our law, and I was happy to do so. These were bad actors who should be in jail. And frankly, this gets to the heart of the reality. We're not doing all that we can do to stop straw purchasers. We're not doing all that we can do under existing law to keep guns out of the hands of those who break our laws. And people are looking for quick fix solutions, which aren't going to solve the problem. And here's the danger. You're going to create a false sense of completion that we've solved the problem with something that's not going to do it. And then we're not going to address the real problem, which is a cultural rot that is taking over, that is have people that are, completely removed from society, people who are detached. This fellow in Plano who's on, 8chan or one of these websites. And, one last point on that. I went to Israel with my colleagues, and we flew in on Friday, and the first thing we did was Shabbat dinner. And for 24 hours, our Israeli counterparts in Jerusalem shut down for 24 hours honoring their Sabbath, and they broke bread, and they had conversations across the table, and they're engaging in community. We've got to get back to that. We've got to get back to knowing who the person down the street is hurting and being able to look after each other and make sure that we're not losing people like a 25-year-old who has something so wrong that he's going into a Walmart and shooting up 25 innocent people. That's just evil in practice, right? Nothing about taking guns away from law-abiding citizens is going to solve that problem. It's going to be looking in the mirror at what's going on in our culture and our society and trying to stop it at the root so that that doesn't occur. It really is something, and let's talk about opioid abuse. Let's talk about the toxicology reports of people that have been carrying out these heinous acts. And so that's where I think we ought to focus and appreciate all y'all are doing here today.
Thank you for that. And John, what would you like to say?
Well, I'm really frustrated by the whole debate. I mean, for 20 years, I've been dealing with this. What amazes me is just how unserious the responses are from people on the side. I want to do something. I want to stop these types of attacks. But we hear things like background checks on private transfers of guns. There's not one mass public shooting this century that would have been stopped by having such a law in effect. And I think the people who make these claims understand that that's the case.
Would you elaborate on that? Because today during the hearing, you actually you tried to set the record straight in the part that I was in. Would you elaborate
Right. Okay,
just a little bit on that?
Up until the Odessa case, you had clear cases where the person either bought the gun legally through a licensed dealer or they stole the gun. And so the notion that having a background check on a private transfer of a gun was irrelevant because none of those involved voluntary private transfers. In the Odessa case, you had a person buy what's called a ghost gun. The person he bought it from was manufacturing guns and selling them to apparently multiple people. You're allowed to make your own guns as long as you keep them yourself. It's a federal felony punished by 5 years in prison for you to go and make one of these guns without a serial number and stuff and then sell it to somebody else who is already committing a major felony that was punishable by 5 years in prison for doing this. So the notion that somehow an additional law that would have said, well, you're not allowed to privately transfer a gun. He was privately transferring a gun that was illegal for him to go and sell. He didn't have a manufacturer's license to be able to go and do that. And so, what I see happening with things like the background checks on private transfers is that, Obama, when he was president, it was the number one and usually the only law that he would call for after each of the mass public shootings. It was completely irrelevant to the shootings. In fact, and you see this regularly after shootings. Within an hour or two, you have politicians calling for new laws, and usually the number one thing that they call for are these universal background checks. And I guess I've come to believe over time that the reason why they want to push them is not that they think it's going to lower crime, because I've told them for 20 years how I thought they could easily get this passed, but just a few reasonable changes. And I think the reason why they push it the way it is just they want to make it costly for people to be able to get guns. So we're in Washington, D.C. right now. If I were to privately give you a gun as a gift or sell it to you, to do it legally, we'd have to go through the FFL here in D.C., and we have to pay $125 for each gun that I would transfer to you. let's say I really believe that background checks help reduce crime. Why would you tax somebody for doing something that you thought would be beneficial? I mean, if anything, you should reward people. If you really believe that background checks on the private transfers of guns were beneficial, why would you tax them for doing that? And beyond that, you know, $125 might not stop you or I from being able to go and get a gun, but the people that my research indicates who benefit the most from owning guns, the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, poor minorities, particularly poor blacks, $125, plus they add the licensing and registration fees and other things here, may make the difference between whether they're legally able to go and obtain a gun to protect themselves and their families. There's an easy way of solving this. Again, if you really want to encourage people and you believe everybody benefits in terms of reduced crime, pay for it out of general revenue. As an economist, I would say the people who benefit should be the ones who pay. And if everybody's benefiting, why would you want to make the law-abiding citizen who's going out of his way to go and obey the law have to bear the entire cost of that? But there's so many other issues with the background check system, things that I just don't even know what reasonable arguments could be made against. And I brought this, as I said, brought these things up for 20 years to gun control advocates and Democrats. So one thing you mentioned earlier was just the false positives. You look at this, today in the hearing we heard 3.5 million dangerous prohibited people have been stopped from buying guns because of background checks. That's simply false. Virtually all these, we don't know the exact number, but you're talking about something well over 96%. I think probably my best guess is around 99% of these are mistakes. It's one thing to stop a felon from buying a gun. It's another thing to stop somebody simply because they've been named similar to a felon from buying a gun. And there's an easy way to fix this. If you were to go to a private businessman who does background checks on his employees and say, you know, would you think of doing background checks using roughly phonetically similar names? They will laugh at you. And if you were to go to Democrats on the Hill and say, you know, I think private companies ought to be able to do background checks using roughly phonetically similar names, they will scream bloody murder saying that that would be discriminatory. And there's a simple reason for that. People tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. Hispanics have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. 30% of black males in the United States are legally prohibited from owning guns because of past criminal history. Well, whose names do you think their names are more likely to be confused with? Other law-abiding, good black males who want to go and buy a gun to protect themselves and their families. Why, you know, you can go and hire a lawyer to go and straighten out the paperwork, snafus there. But I've talked to a number of lawyers. You're talking about usually something that starts around $3,000.
He's
Right.
a Columbine survivor,
Right.
top secret clearance in
Right.
the military, and had a situation like this where he was denied the ability to buy a gun because
Right.
they made a mistake.
Right. Now, and why should somebody have to go and hire a lawyer to go and correct a mistake that the government shouldn't have been making to begin with? If private companies had an error rate that was 100th the error rate that the federal government has, they'd be sued out of existence under federal law. Simple thing. Just make the federal government have to do background checks for guns in the same way that the federal government mandates that private companies have to go and do background checks. Why is that such a difficult thing? And, you know, there are a couple other things that I could go and mention, but over time, I'll give you one example. So a few years ago, when Colorado was passing its background checks on private transfers, I got a call from some state legislators there asking me what amendment that I would put up. And my suggestion was to put up an amendment that would exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state tax on transferring guns. With the exception of 2 pro-gun Democrats in the state House, every other Democrat voted against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state tax. How many taxes can you think of that Democrats will fight tooth and nail against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay?
And they just recently tripled that as well. So the way the Colorado law was written is they can just
governor
decide
could determine what
whatever
the
the price
taxes can
is.
be.
So they decided, oh, it's not covering our costs, so they literally tripled the tax.
And I can give you multiple other examples that are similar to that, but it just has convinced me over time that they want to make it costly and difficult for people to be able to go and get guns. And because I've told them, if they fixed I don't even know how you can argue against the things that I've just brought up in terms of a logical way. And you're going to say something?
Well, I just wanted to add, I was going to mention a few of these things, but with John here, he'll cover it.
Right.
This is why I said what I said, which is the notion of passing something like being suggested right now across, frankly, people in both parties here in Washington are talking about doing something. It will create a false sense of security that avoids the actual problem. That's the danger that really bothers me. I mean, what John's outlining here is that whatever's going to be proposed here is not going to deal with the issues we're dealing with. And we've got bigger societal issues that we need to address and recognize, again, dealing with opioids, dealing with the detached people from society, things that we need to come to grips with as people in this country about how to address. And so the idea that you're going to go pass a law, have a big press conference and say, look at us, we did something. But we're already hearing about the relative, say you do a universal background check. I've got, concerns with that for a number of the reasons outlined. Well, if 90% of them are false positives, you're not getting any real benefit out of doing that in the first place. For, by the way, a tiny fraction that, as John already argued, has not had any connection whatsoever to deal with any of these mass murders in recent memory, and you've got this Odessa situation where the guy was already violating the law. That's my concern, is that we're taking our eye off the ball.
No, I couldn't agree more. Look, I think there are things that we can do to stop most of these mass public shootings. I would do a couple things. I would go and get rid of gun-free zones. I'd encourage more people to go and carry. On our website at crimeresearch.org, I have literally dozens of cases over the last few years where concealed carry permit holders have stopped mass public shootings. They don't get any news attention. If it were me and I was somehow dictator, I would go and give lots of attention to those things, make criminals, these killers who think that they're going to do these types of terrorist attacks, get rid of the gun-free zones, make them know that people stop these things, and go and discourage them from doing it. You can't read these killers' diaries and not come away. I mean, I'm forced to do this because of the work I do, but not come away. These guys plan these things long in advance. 6 months is a short amount of time for them to go and plan it. 1 year, 2 years. The Sandy Hook killer was planning it for 2.5 years prior to the attack. These guys consciously want to go and kill as many people as possible. And you read these things where they say, if I can only kill more people than such and such did, I can get even more news coverage than they did. And so what do you want to do? You want to take away what their goal is in their warped mind. In their warped mind, they want to commit suicide, but they want to do so in a way that people will know that they're here. And they believe the more people they kill, the more people will know about them. So make them believe that they're going to have a hard time successfully killing lots of people. You go and put one police officer in a school or something like that. To me, it's just not a serious response. And the reason is, God thank them for doing the job, but it's an incredibly difficult job to go and be the one armed person there in uniform, because it's kind of like a neon sign above them that says shoot me first, because these killers know if they kill that one person, the only person who has a gun first, then they have essentially free reign to go after other people there. So if they do attack, that's the first person they try to take out. If you allow teachers or other people around there to be able to go and carry and make it so it's not a gun-free zone, you take away that strategic advantage from the killer, because even if it even makes the job of the officer, if you're going to have an officer there, safer, because then this killer knows that if he goes after the officer, he publicly reveals his position, and he has to worry about whether there's somebody behind him or to the side who might be able to go and stop him. We did a study looking at all the school shootings in the United States from 2000 through 2018. You have 20 states, including Texas, that allow teachers to carry. Over a third of the school districts in Texas, as of last fall, had allowed them to carry. And there's not been one attack of any type, or shooting, from an accidental shooting all the way up through a mass public shooting, where anybody's been injured or killed directly from the shooting there at any of these schools in all these states that allow teachers to carry. And you have two issues there. One is this issue of the normal types of debates you have about things that might possibly go wrong. We can look at it, and we can see that the types of concerns about students getting a hold of guns have never happened. Teachers accidentally shooting a student has never happened. But you also have a little bit of evidence with regard to the deterrence effect, the fact that there hasn't been, you have 2,000 school districts. There hasn't been an attack of any type at those types of schools. At least tells you some evidence that they may also be providing deterrence on these things. And even if they don't, if you can have somebody there quickly, the amount of time it takes for somebody to arrive on the scene is very important in limiting the damage.
You look like you're about to say something else.
I would only add there was a editorial or an op-ed, I don't remember which, in the LA Times a couple weeks back saying that there was an estimate, I don't know who did the estimate, of about $75 million worth of free publicity for each one of these
Right.
crazy folks when they're out there and they do this thing, and then you get the copycats and you get so forth. So, my question here is, we're talking about, red flags and the Second Amendment. I mean, when do people want to start talking about red flags for some of these newspapers, right? And some of these people who are responsible for publicizing a lot of this stuff. Now, I wouldn't advocate for that because I believe in the Bill of Rights. And I believe that we should be standing up and we should be advocating for responsible journalism here. But instead, right, they want to throw red flags at law-abiding Second Amendment, citizens.
And we talked about that earlier, and about the need for, that when it comes to suicide, that there are AP standards for how you go about reporting suicide so you don't create a contagion.
Right.
Perhaps the AP should create standards for how you deal with these mass shootings. And instead of giving wall-to-wall 24-hour coverage for every one of them that happens for days on end, they think about the fact that they could be creating a contagion in this situation as well. And I'm not saying that we need laws to tell them how to do their job. I just think they've already done this in other situations. They understand that they could contribute to it, and they've taken steps to stop that. They could step up and do it again if they chose. And Patrick, I think you had something, and then we probably need to start wrapping up because we've been going for a while.
Oh, I'll just add to that, the fact of the matter is, at Columbine High School, those two shooters are like household names now, and I think we have actually come some ways, especially with the Parkland shooter and pushing the no notoriety. I'm a big advocate for that. We shouldn't be using their names at all. Let's just call them by their prison number, not give them the chance to be famous.
But I just say one thing, when you read some of these diaries, these guys say, even if the news doesn't mention my name, I know I'll still be in the history books. These guys still talk about these things in that way. And so, and besides, their names still get out on these things. You're going to have some news media that's going to go and mention their names, and these guys.
I'll just mention this again because you guys joined late, but it's also so very important to point out the heroic acts of not only the good guy and gals with the guns, like the studies that you do and the statistics you put up, but in our Highlands Ranch STEM school shooting this year in Colorado, the 3 young high schoolers who charged.
No, heroic actions.
Yes.
It's too bad that we lose people like that, the very heroes that are willing to put their lives on the line. Whether it be teachers like in Parkland or others that rush to the scene there.
And I don't know that you know this, but JT, who's sitting next to you, his brother Jesse was killed in Sandy Hook, and his brother, when the gun jammed, his brother told his classmates to run, and he saved 9 lives.
Saved 9 classmates, yeah.
A
By
6-year-old.
doing a 6-year-old.
Right.
He stayed back to defend his teacher.
That's amazing.
Extraordinary.
So I want to ask you one thing before I get to your last statement. So in our press conference today, we heard there's a memo circulating on Capitol Hill about background checks. And I think
Is this the president's proposal?
I don't know that it's actually the
So,
president's.
Going to be, or
What is
voted proposal?
what is circulated is a floated proposal, allegedly that came from the Attorney General's office. And in it are a number of suggestions about expanded background checks, particularly with respect to so-called private-to-private transactions. That definition is a little vague, and I think there's a sort of separate system envisioned, and there's a lot of different kind of parts and moving parts to this. The reaction, I think, has been fairly strong by those who recognize where this would take us, which is to a place where we're getting very little to nothing out of it. But on the other hand, significant infringement on law-abiding citizens' ability to defend themselves. And I think I think the president's hearing that. I think I'm glad. And I know a lot of my colleagues that have communicated to the White House that this would not be the direction they ought to go. And I think in communicating to the Attorney General's office the same sentiment. And I think it's just really important for us to continue to get out there right now. So I'm glad you're doing this, and this, all these great patriots here who are standing up to talk about this the right way. Every single one of us. I'm a dad. I have a 10-year-old. I have an 8-year-old. Do you remember when the bombs were going off in Austin and Austin area? And they were just blowing up randomly in different places. Well, one of those was about a mile down the road from my kid's school. We were on high alert. We were wondering what was going on, right? I was at Boy Scouts after school one night, and the number 2 in the law enforcement for the Austin PD, son was in that Boy Scouts, and he had to run when they went and caught him that night at the FedEx down a few miles away. My point is that the dads, we were all in the school the next morning. We were all in a strong presence to make sure that our schools were protected. We were on high alert, paying attention. But you're not going to stop crazy by banning everything under the sun, right? It was a car that killed the woman in Charlottesville. It's, when you've got people who are sick, they're mentally ill, they're hateful, they're evil, they're on opioids, whatever it is, you need to be able to defend yourself and your family. And I can tell you this, sitting in Austin, Texas, 100 and X miles from the border, depending on which direction you go, there's a war going on just across the river in Mexico.
Mexico has a murder rate that's over 6 times higher than ours this year.
It's
and
pretty
talking
extraordinary.
about gun control laws, Mexico, since 1972, has had 1 gun store in the country. It's run by the military. The guns are incredibly expensive. And only about 1% of the population is legally licensed to own a gun in Mexico. And yet,
we see what
gun
unfolds.
crime is crazy.
Right.
Chip, I want to bring it back around with the presidential reelection campaign getting started. For anyone who's watching this or listens to a recording of it later, what would you recommend the message be that they send to their legislators and to the White House? Because from my perspective, I think a wrong move on this issue could cost the president his reelection.
If conservatives, if Republicans want to have a successful 2020, then they're going to stand up in defense of the Constitution, period. And I think that message needs to be heard loudly and clearly. There is a misperception that this is somehow something that is being generated by certain organizations, NRA, GOA, any of these. Those groups, they get a message out, and that's fine. I'm going to tell you, it is people in the district I represent who are in my ear. They know where I come from on this. They are in my ear saying they believe that we need to stand up in defense of the Constitution, stand up in the defense of liberty, stand up in the defense of your right to defend yourself and your families, and that we need to stand up for that here. And I can tell you, I, for one, am going to do that. I think a lot of my colleagues are doing that. I think the president is hearing that. And I think we need to continue to make sure that the president and his administration hears that loudly and clearly. The United States Senate, make sure everyone who's in the United States Senate hears that. Call your representatives, call your senators. Let them know that the Bill of Rights and the Constitution is not for sale in some sort of, fit of wanting to do something that is going to end up harming law-abiding citizens and creating a false sense of security.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up. Everyone else, except for the 2 of you and me, have said what they want to make their lasting statement for tonight. So I'd like to hear that from you. And John Ludd, I would love later to sit down and do a Facebook Live session just with you and go through your PowerPoint presentation so that we can use that as a training tool later. But what would you like to leave as your lasting thought for the people who are watching tonight?
Well, I think for the most part, I think I've covered it, and I don't want to be repetitive. I think there's 2 things that are in my heart right now on this topic, and I've referred to them both. One is that we don't want to take our eye off the ball of what's actually going on, the actual problem, the actual cultural issue that's at stake, by passing a law that will do no real good and that will convince people that it's doing good when it's not. And then concurrent with that is losing people because we're reacting. We're losing a generation of Americans or multiple generations of Americans when we don't stand up and educate why the Second Amendment matters. And that it doesn't just matter because you want to go hunting. It matters because you need to defend yourselves, and it matters because you need to defend against tyranny, right? I mean, you've got to be able to say, whoa, hold on there, right? And when someone like Beto O'Rourke wants to stand up and say, I don't care, I'm coming after your guns, well, then he's going to take a step back and go, well, hold on. This is why the Second Amendment exists in the first place, okay? And so this is something the American people need to internalize and understand, and that is central to our existence as a nation. It's central to who we are. It is why we're still the beacon of hope for the world, and why we're the beacon for liberty in the world, and that civilizations are throughout history that have given up their ability to be armed are those that have experienced tyranny the fastest. And we've seen it over and over and over again in the history of mankind.
And other nations are depending on us to continue to keep freedom alive.
That's right.
And if we let it go out here, it has the potential to go out everywhere around the whole world.
Great point.
I think police are extremely important. I think police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But I think the police themselves understand that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. And that's one reason why I think if you look at surveys of police are probably among the strongest supporters of private ownership of guns, because they know in their own lives how important it is to rely on that if necessary. And they realize that it's the safest course of action for potential victims to take when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves. It'd be great if the police were there all the time, but they're not. And my research convinces me that there's basically two groups of people who benefit the most from owning guns. People who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. You're almost always talking about a male criminal doing the attack, and when a male is attacking a female, there's a larger strength difference than one man attacking another man. And the presence of a gun represents a much bigger relative change in a woman's ability to protect herself. And the other group of people are the ones who are most likely victims of violent crime, and that tends to be some of the most vulnerable people in our society, poor, blacks in particular, who live in high crime urban areas. And the thing that concerns me is that you have all these politicians saying that they care about these minorities, and yet they're imposing rules and stuff and costs that primarily makes it difficult for those individuals in particular to be able to go and defend themselves. And, it'd be great if people weren't facing crime. But given that they are, and given that ultimately in many cases people have to rely on defending themselves, imposing these taxes, using systems that go and make it very costly, have discriminatory effects in terms of who gets denied with background checks. It's just hard for me to understand why it's not more of an issue. Why those people who claim that they care so much about those vulnerable people in our society. It's great that Michael Bloomberg can always go and afford armed bodyguards to go and protect himself. I just give you one example. I was able to get a list of all the concealed carry permit holders in Los Angeles County. There's like 216 out of an adult population of 8.5 million. And nationwide, women make about 34% of permit holders. In Los Angeles County, they make up 7%. Where in Los Angeles County, you have to go and demonstrate need to some local official to prove to them that you need to have a gun. Now, maybe women in Los Angeles County just have a lot less crime committed against them than women in the rest of the country. I kind of doubt that's the case. Blacks make up about 13% of permit holders nationwide. They make up about 6.5% of permit holders in Los Angeles. Hispanics in Los Angeles County make up about 54% of the population. They make up about 6% of the permit holders. So for Democrats who claim that they care about poor minorities, when they're in charge of the process for determining whether somebody has a good explanation, the big thing that seems to determine whether or not somebody gets a concealed carry permit in places like Los Angeles or in New York is whether they've given huge donations to the sheriff or whether they're politically powerful and connected individuals, which is fine. I'm glad that those people care about their safety and they want to go and do something. But they're not the ones who are most likely to be victims of violent crime. And why not give the same type of treatment to the people who are most likely to be the victims of violent crime and need protection.
Thank you for that. My final thoughts would be that as citizens and as people who live in America nationally, but then within our own states and our own communities, we need to be watching out for what's going on in our own communities and be more aware and more connected to our communities. And then I think it's very important that we are educated ourselves and that we educate other people on the Second Amendment and on the entire Constitution, because I think that there are people in this country who are well-meaning and they just don't understand exactly the consequences of what the unintended consequences of what they are calling for. And they look at the Second Amendment alone without looking at it in the context of the entire Constitution. And you cannot look at it just by itself. You have to look at and understand the entire Constitution. We have training at Tea Party Patriots. It's available for free for people if you want to learn more about the Constitution. And I want to get more information from you so that we can have the statistics to back up the reasons why we don't want to do the things that we don't want Congress to do. And I urge every single person to read the book by Andrew Pollack, Why Meadow Died. Read it, figure out what's going on in your own community, make sure that your schools and your communities are thinking ahead of time so that we can prevent things from happening like what happened in Parkland. And my very last and most important thought is we don't need to just do something. The call to just do something is not the right call. We need to do the
Something that works.
We need to do the right thing. And it takes leadership and courage to do the right thing. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you. And thanks for joining us on this live showing, or if you're watching it recorded, and please share it with other people so they can learn more about what we talked about tonight. Thank you.
All right, then. Okay.
Very good.
We need to talk about
I'm Mike Pence. I'm from Indiana, and it's an honor to welcome the largest gathering of conservatives in American history to your nation's capital. We stand together at a historic moment. How we as conservatives respond to these challenges could determine whether America retains her place in the world as a beacon of freedom, or whether we slip into the abyss that has swallowed much of Europe in an avalanche of socialism. While some are prepared to write the obituary on capitalism and the conservative movement, I believe we are on the verge of a great American awakening, and it will begin here and begin now. Let us stand and fight for freedom.